kia whakapapa pōna mo te moana, hei hurahi matato I te rani nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tato ia tato katoa, huie tai kie. May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Emmanuel and I'll be your chair for today. Just so you know, we have an interesting discussion for you today. We are encouraging you to get in touch with us. There's a forum for you to share your questions, share your discussions with us. We have an awesome presenters who answer all your questions for you, hopefully. Of course, we will try to answer all your questions as much as we can. So please get in touch. Use the chat section on the Zoom section and share your feedback with us. Today's topic really is on can understanding whiteness improve anti-racism activities in health? This is a very interesting topic. And to help us understand that, our two presenters, Sume and Nancy. Sume is a senior knowledge translation specialist at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. She leads initiatives focused on public health practice related to health equity and the social determinants of health in partnership with stakeholders across Canada. She's a skilled and knowledgeable facilitator. She's a writer, she's an advisor, and she's going to help us in understanding whiteness. Nancy is a Cree Métis from Beaver River area of the prairies. She has a history of over 20 years in research in the downtown east side of Vancouver in homelessness, mental health, problematic substance use, and opioid replacement. It was there that she was mentored into harm reduction, Indigenous rights, and social justice. She's an Indigenous health consultant, and she's currently in her 5th year of study in a PhD program at the School of Public Health and Population Health at University of British Columbia. So these are our presenters for today. So please let's welcome them as they take us through how understanding whiteness can improve anti-racism activities in health. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Thanks so much for having us here. So I'll ask Nancy to introduce herself as we get our slides going here.
Nancy Laliberte. As Emmanuel mentioned, I'm Cree Métis from the Beaver River area of the prairies here in what's currently known as Canada. Today I'm calling in from the Chippewas of Rama First Nation land, signatories of the Williams Treaties.
Thanks, Nancy. And I'm Sume Ndumbe-Eyoh. As Emmanuel mentioned, I work with the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. I'm calling in today from Montreal to Taika, which is the traditional homeland of the Mohawk people. The center I work for, the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, is based out of the east coast of Canada. And we are located in Mi'kmahi, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I think just if we think about the conference title, so it's acknowledged that the territory where NCDH is hosted is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. And we have a little bit about that treaty on the slide. I've been I struggle with guests because no one really invited me here. I've been a guest in Turtle Island for the last 18 years or so, and I am originally from Cameroon, which is where my family still lives, and which is what I really think about as home. So for our conversation today, as Emmanuel mentioned, we're really hoping to get to hear from you, and you can use the chat box throughout to send in your comments throughout the session. So today we're going to be talking about what whiteness means. So how does whiteness show up in our lives? From a systemic level down to an individual level. And we'll talk a little bit about the impact of whiteness on health and share some of our thoughts about where we go from here, so the way forward. We have designed this a bit as a conversation between Nancy and I, so we'll be posing questions questions, which we will both respond to. And we're asking that when you see a question on the screen, you also share your response and your thoughts to that question in the chat box. So we hope that works and that we have a bit of a fun conversation together. So our first question for you is, how can understanding whiteness make you a more centered and effective anti-racist practitioner and leader? Nancy, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Sume. Probably the biggest part of this piece is actually naming whiteness. It tends to be invisible in our societies and is seen as normal. White people sometimes don't realize that they have a race and are racialized people. And I think health equity initiatives have begun acknowledging the prevalence of racism and white supremacy in health and public health institutions. And we need to understand whiteness to be able to disrupt it and work towards health equity. Sume?
Great, thanks, Nan. So I think I'm just listening to what you're saying. So at the NCCDH, we've been doing some work on racism over the last, I'd say 3-4 years or so. And our broader mandate really is to support the field of public health, to think about health equity. And what you're saying definitely resonates with my experience, because what I think one of my observations is at some point the health equity field was really looking at issues of equity related to things like income, which is supremely important. I think for those of us on the line who do work, think about how things outside of healthcare and the health system impact health, we can understand how important income is to our health, gender, and all. In fact, and racism seemed to be this one very glaring omission in the conversation. It was like, I knew it was important. Lots of people I know it's important, but we just didn't quite talk about it. So as we started having conversations about anti-racism and what it means to take an anti-racist approach in the health sector specifically, I've become more convinced that for us to do that effectively, we have to put whiteness at the core, because ultimately when we're talking about the profound differences and inequities you see in terms of racialized health outcomes and experiences, it's firmly rooted in systems which privilege whiteness. I think if we can start to understand how whiteness functions, what its purpose is, because it does serve a purpose, then it starts to get us to, it starts to point us to places where we can actually intervene and do something different, both in our lives as individuals, at the level of our organizations, and what we do in broader structures. So I'm not sure if we have any comments to that question in the chat box. Please, would like to know from you, our participants, how can understanding whiteness make you a more centered and effective anti-racist practitioner and leader? Okay, so we'll be paying attention to that and sharing that as we go. So we'll just move on. And our next question is, how does whiteness reveal itself? So we love this quote by Toni Morrison. I love that picture. She looks very, I love that picture of her. She says, "My project is an effort to avert the critical gaze from the racial object to the racial subject, from the described and imagined to the describers and imaginers, from the serving to the served." And I think this really speaks to what we're just talking, Nancy and I were just talking about earlier, to just turning the focus from indigenous peoples, from racialized peoples, from Black peoples, from colonized people, to say, how does whiteness play out? So really turn that gaze. I think in a lot of work I do in the health field, we normally start looking at people, marginalized communities, disadvantaged communities, underserved communities. And this really is, looking at whiteness really turns that on its head to say, okay, how are the systems creating some of those disadvantages we are seeing? And how are we all, and particularly how are white people implicated in perpetrating this system? And as Nancy mentioned earlier, really making it very visible, because when we start to make it visible, then we can start to really unpack it more. So we're going to start exploring this question from multiple levels. So we have here what we're calling sort of a conceptual mapping of multi-level manifestations of whiteness. So in our conversation, we're going to start at the very top, talking about more systemic and structural things. We're going to move out and explore how whiteness reveals itself at the level of institutions, and then focus on the interpersonal and individual levels. And so I'm going to ask Nancy to get us started on how does whiteness reveal itself in systems, focusing on settler colonial states.
Thank you, Sume. So while this is not a fulsome timeline that you see here, it does give you some ideas of some of the pivotal events over time, what have happened in Canada. So Canada was founded on the doctrine of terra nullius, or empty land, and the myth that the land was uninhabited by sovereign peoples and nations. The doctrine of discovery was also used as moral and legal justification for a colonial dispossession of sovereign Indigenous nations. So in coming more into recent history, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, and most recently, the calls for justice of the inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, all call for the repudiation of these concepts of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, as they were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands. But this to date has not happened. And the first one of these recommendations was in 1996. I mean, white dominant systems have been used to justify slavery, oppression, theft of Indigenous lands, and subjugation of Indigenous peoples to Christian education, which has resulted in social, economic, and health inequities that persist today. I have an example from my own family of how whiteness has manifested in our family. My grandmother was forced to attend residential school, and my mother was required to live in a convent and receive a Catholic education. So many of members of my family remain Catholic or Christian and have lost their own creed beliefs and creation stories in less than 3 generations. My great grandfather practiced sweat lodge and he knew medicines. And now my generation can't be taught our Cree ways by our parents and grandparents because they practice Christianity. So that's a big impact of whiteness on my family. White dominance in Canada has been the root of many injustices to racialized peoples: slavery of Black people, Chinese laborers on the railroad, excluding immigrants from India by denying port entry to the Kamgata Maru, and the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. Canadian colonial institutions are rooted in a system of whiteness that undermines Indigenous sovereignty and continues to this day. Thanks, Sume.
Great, thank you, Nancy. Nancy, as you're speaking, I think you're really weaving in. You're taking this really abstract, macro things and bringing it down to the level of your family. And I often think about how we can draw those direct links between policies and how we actually live our everyday lives in communities. And so if I think about, some of those the trajectories you're painting. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, I've been living in Turtle Island for about 18 or so years. And so my experience of colonial quite different from Nancy's experience of colonialism living in a settler state. At the same time, Nancy talked about terra nullius, right? So this idea that Europeans came to a no man's land and there's no one living here. I often think about, for me as someone who is from a colonized country, now living in a settler colony, how my own narratives and my own ideas of Canada have evolved over time. And even thinking about the histories I learned about the construction of Cameroon. So back in the day when I went to high school, they probably still teach this. You learned sort of African history, and then it stopped, like ancient. I think it was Vasco da Gama. I've tried to forget his name actually as part of my own healing practice, try to forget some of that history. He discovers Cameroon, right, because he sees this mountain erupt. And that is a story we teach ourselves. We teach ourselves that. So that's the narrative we have of that place called Cameroon, which, by the way, comes from a Portuguese word for shrimp. So we're still living with that history, and it's still informing our everyday lives. And then think about the Canadian context, which, as we're talking about, is a settler colony similar to New Zealand, but we're speaking about our Canadian context here. I think about the narratives which new immigrants to Canada learn, right? And the history we learn about Canada and the story. Audra Simpson, who is an Indigenous anthropologist, she talks about Canada being imagined as this place of settler founding and immigrants and immigration, and that idea of Canada as an immigrant place is a very core part of the Canadian narrative of who we are as a country. It's something which most Canadians are very proud of. And in starting to unpack some of these examples we have in our timeline, we're actively disrupting that idea of Canada as this place of settler founding and a place for immigrants, really. And I think it really helps us center that First Peoples, and it helps center Canada as Indigenous lands. And this to me takes me to sort of what informs the policies and the practices within systems, both in health and outside of health. So I just use the example of education. We can see how as a state then creates seemingly normal things in the education which we get as a kid. And media also is a huge way in which ideas about place and colony and what is considered normal and okay get perpetuated. So I often think about my now 10-year-old niece who lives in the UK. And when she started going to school, when she was about 4 years old, she's this amazing firecracker of a kid, smart as a whip, super creative. And she starts to go to school. And by day 2, this kid comes home and she wants to be blonde, right? So, and this is 2 days of socialization in the world. And my sister, if you know my sister is like a rah-rah, like she's down for the cause, you know? So it doesn't take much for us to learn these messages and start to internalize them, both as racialized peoples, but also as white people, right? And our institutions then perpetuate those ideas and really reinforce them throughout.
Awesome. So just sharing a few of the comments that has come through from our participants. I think one shares an interesting one. It says, for me, understanding whiteness, my own, makes me more able to recognize and respond in a transformative way for myself and others. It also better places me as a potential ally, particularly where my own health modalities have some resonance, which further encourages areas where I am an ally in terms of my own preferred choice of health modalities. And there's a question that has come through. I don't know when you want to answer this, but you may want to think about this as you go along with your presentation. How can we make whiteness and its impact glaringly, undeniably obvious to white people? How can we make whiteness and its impact undeniably obvious to white people?
Thank you, Mel. That's an interesting question. I'll ask the question in a slightly different way. So I think part of the reason why we frame today's conversation firmly in terms of anti-racism is because my experience is there are lots of white people who are already doing anti-racism work and who want to be actively a part of the solution. And one of the comments you shared, Emmanuel, talked about being a better ally, supporting transformative change. And I think that has been, at least in anti-racism spaces, that has been, and in terms of, so to me, that's where we start. We start with people who are already committed to making a difference. I do think that there are lots of people, and as we go through, we'll talk a bit more about this when we get to the part about oneness revealed and stuff, because part of the way in which whiteness functions on an individual level, I believe, is actually to disconnect people from each other. It actively works to make our societal problems seem very individual, and COVID-19, I guess is a perfect example here. But then every now and then, if we can find things which actually bring us together and can find a point of, then it expands that. One of the things which has been happening in speaking about the impact of whiteness in the US is starting to see a decline in well-being, particularly for lower income white folks. And the people who have been exploring this just talk about how lower income white folks are still pledging allegiance to systems which were never really designed to protect them, right? Those systems were designed to build capital for rich white folks and capital for the elite. But because going back to ideologies, like because of our ideologies are so deeply rooted, sometimes everyday white folks act policies which are actually not to their benefit, and actually actively resist policies which could improve their lives. And before I was getting on the call, I was thinking about the example of anti-poverty work. We have a high rate of Indigenous and racialized folks who are living in poverty, right? But in terms of actual numbers, you actually have more poor white people in Canada today, right? So if we can get past this highly individualistic way of seeing the world and say, actually, we are all in this together. I think finding those points of, and in many ways, resisting the urge to demonize white folks, right? Because that's something which starts to happen as we start to, we start to understand how whiteness functions. And maybe this is a good time to switch to this slide. We start to understand how it functions. One of the ways in which it starts to manifest for at the individual level is, I'm a good white person. I'm one of the good ones, right? And that kind of response actually then prevents further connection. So I think it's, as we do this, it's just finding ways to find common ground, which can sometimes be very difficult, but I think is also very possible with people who may share a common interest. And I find also experiences of oppression are sometimes a common point. So my other observation is low-income white folks can wrap their heads around this a bit easier, because you understand what it means to live in a system which was not designed to serve you. And I'm going to invite Nancy to share some of her thoughts to that question.
Thank you for that question. It's kind of the one we've been working on for a while, because I think when people start to do this kind of work, it's hard for them to kind of move through kind of the white fragility pieces and the white denial pieces. And I think that's why we started this presentation, as we have to name it. We have to know what it is and understand it. And I think sometimes as racialized people, we do spend a lot of time understanding the system that oppresses us, but I'm not sure that the white population necessarily has the same critique. So I think that those are kind of some key pieces, is, you know, being able to work with BIPOC people and white people together sometimes and apart other times, maybe in these conversations. Because sometimes the denial piece can be a little bit tough to handle, and can kind of we can experience like violence sometimes. So sometimes we have to do that kind of racial caucus work together to move through hard pieces. But I think the key pieces, you know, like we can connect on issues, and like don't feel like you need to run off on your own and do everything, because I think it's important that BIPOC people are involved in equity work. Otherwise it can go a little bit sideways. I know, like in my own institution, equity work tends to be done by largely white women, and we need to also be at those tables expressing our points of view and working collaboratively. Thank you, Sume.
Absolutely, thanks, Nancy. So we're going to go now to the next question, which is, how does whiteness reveal itself in institutions? And Nancy, I think you're just sort of introducing that idea of what it looks like when organizations start to respond to anti-racism, start to think about decolonizing practices within institutions. And I just shared is really great in terms of who actually gets to lead. Or institutions broadly, but also gets to lead work around health, around equity generally. And what you just shared has been exactly my own experience in mainstream health organizations, like who is leading conversations on anti-racism. So I have observed many instances where you have a white woman who's the lead, and in the shadows somewhere is usually racialized women. Well, I spent a lot of time in Toronto. So in Toronto, it tends to be usually Black women, Indigenous women, women of South Asian descent, who are then doing work, but are not allowed to, institutionally, are not allowed to actually claim that work and claim that space and claim that leadership. I think that's really one of the profound ways in which whiteness reveals itself in institutions, is through who gets to lead, right? And on the screen here is a random parliament in a random European-led country. And we can see just like representations from the highest level from our political institutions through to our health systems. There was an interesting study done in Montreal, which is where I'm based now, looking at a leadership of racialized folks in the sector. And it was abysmal. So about a quarter of the population is racialized, and in most sectors, the percentage of racialized folks in high-level leadership positions was 4 to at best 7%. And this was across sectors. It was in health, it was in the private sector, it was in the nonprofit sector, it was in public appointments. So things like government appointed boards. So I think leadership is a really critical way, because the power of leadership is leadership is where you get to decide. You get to decide the priorities. You get to decide what gets funded, what does not get funded. You get to really, in a sense, define people's realities. And so if we have only one perspective being represented at the leadership tables, then what does that mean for what we do? And I'll say one thing. So normally we talk about Eurocentricity as if it's a bad thing. And I don't think it is, actually. I think it's just one way of being. It's just one point of view, because there's lots we can learn from different knowledge traditions and bring it into our work. But it becomes challenging when the only thing we ever reference is Eurocentric knowledge, right? So that's, I think, for me, one way in which whiteness reveals itself in institutions at a level of leadership. Nan?
Yeah, I agree. That's great, Sume. I think Indigenous peoples have definitely experienced that kind of level of epistemic violence, where their ways of knowing and their knowledge are just, disregarded or somehow seen as historical rather than current and present in the day. I think some other challenges that come through too is that settler colonial systems are basically created to benefit white settler colonial people. And I think sometimes it's very hard for people to wrap their brains around that, because people feel like they work hard, and they do. But the other side of the coin is that sometimes racialized people can work just as hard and still not attain the same things that sometimes white people have. And like with meritocracy, such a big part of like neoliberal society, it's very difficult to crack that down. And it's not that people don't think that European people shouldn't have anything. It's just that we should work more together to have a more equitable system, so that people do get the same opportunities and chances in life. I think that too, with when it comes to health anyway, Indigenous people can experience racial profiling like no other group in Canada, except perhaps for Black people. And as a result of this, are more susceptible to health issues. And then this becomes a colonial belief that Indigenous people are weaker and more inferior to white people, which is not true. It's effects of racism and colonialism. And those can be prevalent beliefs across institutions and the system. And those are, I think, tough nuts to crack, but there's places to start there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Because we're both, so Nancy and I both do work in the health space, and we're just talking about epistemic violence and knowledge and things like that. One of the things I've observed also in health institutions is just from a research perspective, what we do. So in many ways, Indigenous, racialized, colonized people are over-researched, but over-researched in many of the wrong ways. So Nancy, you were just talking about when we start to see higher rates of illness in certain Indigenous communities, what do we attribute that to? So sometimes we can do all that great research and we can get the same data and then analyze it through very white and colonial lenses, right? So then you go to an analysis which says the problem is inherent in communities as opposed to the problem is inherent in the systems. And Nancy, you've been doing some interesting work around that data piece, and you're talking about turning the gaze on settler states. Can you talk a little bit about that from a data perspective and a research perspective?
Sure. basically, I've been working with some other colleagues in population and public health, and trying to create a suite of indicators that actually monitor the harm that the settler state does to Indigenous peoples through their policies. So we're just kind of, instead of like always focusing on the Indigenous body, like focus on the body that's actually making the body unwell. So some of the pieces we've looked at so far are resource allocations to Indigenous communities, land justice, and another piece is also the great work that Cindy Blackstock does with children in care. And unfortunately, there are many indicators like this in Canada for the level of injustice experienced by Indigenous peoples. Thanks, Sume. That's all.
Thanks, Nancy. And for those of you who do not know Cindy Blackstock, she is, we can share some information. She's done some really incredible work here in this context. So we started talking a little bit about whiteness and how it reveals itself in the self. And Nancy talked a bit about denial and white invisibility, which I think is a great point to bring here. I'm also seeing some comments from participants, which I think one of them is directly related to this. Okay, so someone is sharing, I need to understand whiteness being white. I have only just begun understanding the issues. I want to know how to be a good ally, so I'm listening intently, which I think is a really good place to kick up this point around how it reveals in the self. I think because it's so invisible, and I actually don't think whiteness is invisible. I think it appears to be invisible if you're just swimming in and it works for you. And when it doesn't work for you, it is almost all you can see, right? So I often joke that if I walk into a room, a restaurant, a classroom, at a conference, I go like in 2 seconds, I can give you a breakdown of who's not there. And I'm like, okay, I see 1, 2, 3 black people, great. Oh, maybe. So when you're not surrounded by whiteness, when you're not white, I should put it that way, you notice those things. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we used the example of my niece. Even as children, we all do. And one of the ways I know this to be true from my own experience is it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much for it to surface. So if, for example, this is a true story, I'm in a fancy bar in Toronto, rooftop, nice, with a friend, we're having great drinks, and the waitress is ignoring us for a little while. And my friend says to the manager, I don't think you really want us here. And she says to us, and she stresses it, right? He immediately responds. She doesn't need to explain what she means by us, because we do know that race matters, even when we don't want to accept it. And one of the ways in which I love this quote by Frantz Fanon, and he talks about what whiteness does to white people is it makes white people see themselves as predestined masters of the world, right? So it's almost taking for granted that your way of life, your preferences is just automatically what should happen, right? It's just the norm, and it's not questioned. It's never questioned actively. And another example which comes to mind, linking this to sort of things which happen at the example of workplaces, there's been an ongoing conversation in Canada, and I'm sure in New Zealand too, around, say, representation in the workplace. Again, another true story. Someone says, I've decided because I thought I'm going to let someone else have it. It sounds like a really good thing, right? It does. But even in that is this assumption that somehow it is yours as a white person to give up. Except it's not really. It is just a job which really should be open to anyone. But even the sense that, again, predestined master of the world, so I am giving something up so someone else can have it, I think is part of how whiteness plays out at the individual level. Fanon goes on to say that corrupts the soul of the white man. We talked earlier about this individual way of seeing the world and how whiteness really as communities. So one of the ways in which whiteness functions. So in terms of impact in the US, and there's been a lot of research done there in the US, mental health, white folks seem to have higher rates of mental health issues. Even things around substance use are also higher. And part of the theorizing behind that is some lack of community connection. So while in other communities where you would expect to see some of those problems, you don't see them as in high rates. And the argument there is because some communities, like say Black communities, for example, are more socially connected. In some African American communities, a big part of how communities organize and operate. So things like, alcohol use are not really encouraged. So that serves to be a protective factor. So I think here it's speaking a bit to how whiteness is actually damaging to white people, right? It actually hurts white people in multiple ways. Nancy?
Thanks, Sume. Yeah, there's been some really interesting research done on whiteness, and a lot of the issue is also the perception that people are. Thanks, Sume. People are under attack, and they're frightened, and that leads to higher substance use rates, more mental health issues, more suicide. There's actually a really good book came out recently, because we're public health people, right? Dying of Whiteness. It's in our resource list at the end as well, where he kind of goes through different case studies in the American context, where he looks at these perceived threats. So it's a perceived threat of a loss in social status if you allow more non-white people into your country. So I mean, it's quite interesting to have a look at that work, because I don't think it's necessarily anything that some people have looked at before. It's fairly new literature, and I'd encourage you to have a look at it if you're looking at ways to kind of explore whiteness. There's a lot of great work out there by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars on white fragility. Someone also mentioned that in the chat. And Understanding White Privilege, Kendall, that's also a very good resource as well. And those are really good places to start. And also understanding that you actually do have a white racial identity, and what does that mean in the context of the world that you live in. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yeah, this is a really great comment there, which is simple in its greatness. Don't ask a fish to describe water, right? I think that just speaks to the fact that when you're in something, when it's for you, it's hard to see, because it just, it's just what it is. So thank you. And I think because it's just what is, it's a really nice segue to the bell hooks quote there, which is, she talks about how because whiteness is so normal, she says that it leads whites to believe that there is no representation of whiteness as terror or as terrorizing, right, to other people. Because if you experience a system as fair, as just, as working for you, sometimes, because honestly, and I saw a comment about capitalism, our current structures do not work for most everyday people. White, Indigenous, racialized, our current structures do not work for most people. And we're seeing that right now in the current global pandemic. They do not work for most of us. But because you're swimming in that water, it's hard to see that as a threat to other people. So it's very easy to imagine young Black men as highly violent and highly threatening. But if you think about the state as wielding white power on an ongoing basis, then you can think about terror as endemic, as structural, as everyday, and it's all around you. And if the state is really designed to protect you, again, sometimes, not always, then it's hard to see the state as unjust. A great example I think of here is police, right? Police for a lot of white folks are seen as friendly people here to protect the community. I have way too many true stories. I'm gonna drop another true story. I remember I am coming home from, I think it's 4 a.m. in the morning, out at a party in Toronto with some friends. A friend of mine is driving and we got stopped by the cops. This is a Black friend of mine. And in that moment, it's hard to describe, but he almost got paralyzed. Almost. He was instantly terrorized, because for a lot of Black men, the police are highly dangerous. I think we've all heard about the case, stories of police Black people, which is an endemic thing. So think about, okay, how something which seems seemingly normal to me, designed to protect me, how does it not protect other people, right? I'm sure if you go on Twitter, you can find hashtags about, sleeping while Black and things like that, which is referring to a Black student who was on a university campus who has the police called on her, right? So again, it's thinking, how are the experiences different? And what do you not get to observe because you are white? Like, what are you protected from? Both individually, and then take that up through from the individual to the institutional to the systemic, right? So this feels like a good point for us to talk about some solutions. So Nancy, what do we do about all of this? How do we disrupt whiteness?
Well, we have a few tips for you. So taking a decolonizing anti-racist approach, so for Indigenous peoples, that would mean to making sure that we're including the true history of the lands that we live on, and ensuring that settler colonialism is definitely included in the critique, along with anti-racism. In the past, that has been missing, but it's much better now. Adopting a critical whiteness approach. So we have some points here, like reflecting on one's own practice and relationships, paying attention to power dynamics, educating oneself on relevant social and political issues, considering race and racial inequities in evaluations and assessments, and thinking about change at a systems level. Did you want to add anything there, Sume?
Great, thanks, Nancy. I just wanted to comment on your piece around educating oneself. And I think one of the great things is there's so much out there already written about whiteness, about racism, which people can draw from. There are great examples about white people acting as good allies. And I use good not as you're a good person, but there's a commitment to do the right thing. There's a commitment to learn. There's a commitment to course correct when you do something and it's not quite the right thing, which we all do and we will all do. So, because the more you try and address racism, the more mistakes you will get to have to make. And that's just how it works with most things in life. So the more you try and disrupt whiteness, you will fail a couple of times. You will do things where you're like, oops, I just said that, or I just did that, or I didn't even realize I just did that. So I think one thing to do is just staying in and being in for the long haul and knowing that mistakes will be made. And it is that commitment to learn and to really focus on the impact of one's action, so the impact of your action as an individual, as an institution, and not try and justify. So I think part of what happened in a lot of anti-racism work and equity work is a lot of fancy PR exercises, public relation exercises, right? So we're talking about an organizational commitment. So we've seen really great examples of organizations investing in developing, and there'll be like a big PR splash. Actually, we don't have to go far. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports in Canada is a great example, which when that was launched, there was this sense from the Canadian government that this matters. We are going to go through this national process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And over the last couple of years, it's become very clear that Nancy jumping here, like the commitment of the federal government to actually follow through with some of those is mixed. So there are some things, so sometimes things happen which seem like progress and then they don't move on. Nancy talked about land justice, right? So if there's a full commitment to disrupting whiteness, to reconciling, land justice has to be part of that, but it has to be a full part of that. And land justice can happen, again, it feels like a macro thing, but let's take that down to the level of the individual. So if as an individual practitioner, leader in this area, you think about those everyday interactions, think about whose voice gets amplified. So one of the things I'm doing in my own personal practice, again, whiteness affects all of us. So the people I tend to cite in my work, right, are some very mainstream folks. When I write about equity, I cite Michael Marmot, who does great work, by the way, but that's beside the point. But the things he says, Indigenous folks have been saying that 4 years. Black folks have been saying that 4 years. Feminists have been saying that 4 years. So just again, just trying to decenter and recenter other voices, I think is a really critical way in which we can interrupt whiteness. And I think there's also the level of, we're talking a bit about institutions, and if you think about, say, health institutions, Nancy, in your work, can you share some examples about how that is happening in terms of sort of health, in the health sector specifically?
Sure, we did get a request to repeat the list because I kind of went through it fast. I can do that for you now if that's, I think it was Pip. Are you ready to write them down this time? I'll go slower. Okay. So taking a critical whiteness approach means reflecting on one's own practice and relationships, paying attention to power dynamics, educating oneself on relevant social and political issues, considering race and racial inequities in evaluations and assessments, and thinking about change at a systems level.
Great, thanks, Nancy.
Okay, and Sume, that was the question about institutional.
Yeah, so just examples about how we can disrupt whiteness at the level of institutions, drawing from some of your experience in the health sector.
Right. Well, a big part of the work that we do in Indigenous health is actually being present at conversations and tables where they're trying to make institutional level changes. For example, the example that Sume brought up about hiring. So there's recruitment and retention strategies that are drafted by the HR department. However, they've kind of skipped over the issue of institutional capacity and readiness on their end. And they just think that if they hire more people and try to keep them around for 5 years, that it's going to be successful without first doing that work to ensure that their managers and leaders feel comfortable in being able to support a more racialized workforce in their organizations. I think some other larger examples have been around Indigenous cultural safety, in particularly in British Columbia, where I work. There's actually declarations of commitments signed by health authorities who are making a commitment to make cultural safety and humility a priority. And those kinds of agreements can work well with health practitioners and regulators. It's worth having a look at the declarations that they have, because we do rely on them again and again, also with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because in BC there are, it's been brought into law, it's Bill 41, that they're implementing on the UNDRIP, and also the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Sume says she's absolutely right. We have a scorecard, national scorecard, and I think it's hovering around 20 or so where people have made progress on some of these calls to action, but some again go backwards because, for instance, the National Northern radio station was adequately funded for 1 year, but then defunded. So it kind of goes back and forth, and you have to kind of pay attention to what the state is doing. Sume?
Great, thank you. So we have a question for you. How can an organizational commitment to decolonizing anti-racist practice help to disrupt systems of whiteness? And this is our question to you, our guests here and co-presenters. I feel like there's some really good conversation happening in the chat, which we're paying attention to, but we can't read everything. And we're also dropping in some of what Nancy shared earlier. So that's going to be coming in, just can't type as fast. So I want to continue with, so we've talked a lot about disrupting whiteness. So we've described whiteness, and we just thought we would highlight the impact. And I'm going to skip to this. So I mentioned earlier as I was speaking that whiteness does have an impact on the health of white folks. And there's been some really interesting work happening, trying to model what those impacts are. And so this is a paper in the Journal of Social Medicine, I believe, and they talk about capitalism. There was a question about capitalism earlier. So yes, in this framework, you can see how they're making the links between capitalism, ideologies of whiteness, our histories, and racial categories, which then inform social policies, macroeconomic conditions, and social events such as political change. And then so you go from sort of the whiteness at the structural level to individual characteristics and experiences. So this is another way of just thinking through what we've just been talking about. I find the piece on psychosocial responses really interesting, and going back to how do we engage more people in this conversation. I think when you talk to people across races, across class, across gender, people are looking for connection, which we've said before. And one of the ways in which whiteness impacts white people is distress. And Nancy talked about this perceived loss of status, right? So even when your material condition has not changed, so you're still making as much money as you made, you still have a well-paid job, and I know not everyone has those things, examples only, you can still feel that threat. And one of the examples, I think it may be in white fragility, but it may not, so don't quote me on that. Talk about someone saying, well, they are coming to take all our jobs, right? Speaking about racialized and indigenous people, they're coming to take all our jobs. And then you look around the room and it's a sea of white people. There's not a single racialized person in the room. There's not a single indigenous person, but that perception is still there, right? So I think I found this model interesting because it's one of the few examples I've seen which actually maps it out from a health perspective. And we're talking health, but when Nancy and I are talking health, we're really going to those societal conditions and elevating it to the structural. So I find it's a very useful model from, I hear a lot of geeks, a lot of super nerds on the line. So this one's for you. So just again, thinking about those policy areas. So I would say undoing whiteness, we can do this in every domain of life. Think about power and belonging, from settler colonialism to addressing racism itself, democracy, who gets to lead at every level, from politics to our institutions, gender equity. So in my mind, undoing whiteness doesn't rest with one discipline. It really cuts across. In early life, we know that our early years are really very formative in terms of our health and well-being, education, the economy. I can't help myself, but COVID-19 is on my brain. We're seeing, economic resources. So we're seeing in Canada right now, there's different versions of lockdowns happening. But one of the things just come up very quickly is who gets impacted by that, right? So some folks like me and Nancy, we can work from home, and a lot of people can't. I think the estimates are about 30% or so of the Canadian working population can actually have work from home. And we've said they are essential services. Essential services are grocery stores. We want our postal service to keep running. What else is essential, Nancy? We want our garbage to still be collected. Think about it. Who is more likely to be in those positions? It's racialized peoples, right? So we can see how these things are all deeply connected. And so there are people starting to have conversations about that. I'm not hearing it as much in the Canadian context quite yet, but I've seen some things coming about from the US, just making those connections that as we are responding to this pandemic, to this particular global moment, that we keep our equity at the center of our responses, we keep our decolonizing anti-racism analysis at the center of every action we do. And we think about how people are going to be differently impacted by this, and think about who we protect and who we don't, right? And I actually think there's something very beautiful happening right now. I'm seeing extreme displays of solidarity. I'm seeing governments working together across sectors, which for those of you who do work in this space, you're probably thinking about how you work across sectors. Usually we say things like, it takes a lot of time, change is slow, and then we see that maybe not. Maybe in, click a finger, we can close down borders, which, that's a longer story because sometimes we want to keep borders open for certain things. But we can see that we can work together when there is enough political will. Our leaders can come together and do the right thing. So that takes me back to democracy. I think just actively raising these conversations at the level of decision making, I think, is a really critical area of intervention. So we have one last question, and then we will have you answer that question. Don't you just love her? Some girl power here. So what practices can organizations put in place to recognize systems of whiteness? So I can tell that there are lots of folks on the line right now who are doing this work very actively. So please share some tips with us. What have you put in place which is making a difference in your practice? Nancy shared a few already, which I think are very encouraging. Okay, so we'll let those come in. And Nancy, any last words?
Yeah, I think an important part of this piece is making opportunities for unlearning. I mean, all of us, whether we're Indigenous, racialized, Black, we've learned in the white system, and so we also need to decolonize ourselves, and white people as well. We all need to unlearn all of the things we think we know by operating in the system of whiteness.
Great, thanks, Nancy. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. So we have one question, which I think we have time for. The question is, if settlers wanted to decolonize our institution, wouldn't it make more sense to appoint Indigenous peoples or migrants of color to run those institutions? Nancy, what's your thought about that question?
I think that's a challenging question, just because when we are seen as being treated in a special way, it often comes back and impacts us negatively. Like sometimes if there's like X amount of seats set aside for people in a certain university or medical school, there can be a lot of backlash to those people. And I mean, the reality is if it was just a fair assessment process, there's enough of us that, you know, have the education and experience that would qualify for those jobs if the opportunities were made available. What do you think, Sume?
Well, that's a good point. I do think that we need Indigenous and racialized people in leadership positions across all institutions, regardless of what the institution is about. So if you're a math organization, I want to see some, you know, Indigenous or Black folk there. Now, in terms of who actually leads, what I've seen is for that to happen, the organization needs to be ready for that. The organization needs to be in the place where it has done its own unlearning, its own work. It has invested in the systems and the structures so that if and when you are blessed with a radical Indigenous leader who is coming with a decolonizing anti-racist approach, you actually have systems in place to support them. Because what I've seen is there's a lot of tokenizing happening. You hire one person, they're the only person, they have zero support, and they're left on their own, and they burn out. They seemingly leave of their own accord, but the organization really is not ready for that. It has not done the work to create a space where we can come in and thrive. We can come in and be healthy, because if we are in leadership positions, we're not there to, ultimately, we are trying to think about a world where we all get to live and thrive and live dignified lives. So before you bring in racialized Indigenous leaders, do your work. And when you do your work, actually, you may find that you start to naturally attract them, because people look around, and when you see that organizations are doing good work, you kind of want to work with those people. You say, oh, something interesting is happening here. So I think it's a place where I want to dip my toes, and I think this may be a good place for me. So I guess my last word is do your work as an institution. So we'll leave you with this, this quote, which is from Ibram Kendi. Nancy probably has 2 of his books in her room right now, which she can pull up for us if she can find them quickly enough. And he says, the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. So I think our work really is not just to understand it, but to move to that last bit, which is actively dismantling these oppressive and settler colonial system. So thank you, Emmanuel. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I think our participants have been blessed to have you guys to share your wisdom. And I think for me, the key things I've taken from this is you need to acknowledge whiteness and sometimes talk about the myth of meritocracy and the stereotypes that come along with indigenous people and racialized people as well. And I think we need to also think about how to disrupt whiteness. And key among them, you said educating oneself, paying attention to the power dynamics, and thinking about change at the systems level. And I like what Nancy said, unlearn all the things we think we know, which is quite profound. I think it's a good way to think about whiteness. So thank you so much, and thank you for all who has shared your comments with us. We've really enjoyed your participation, and it's been awesome. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, and thank you to all. I think I'll end with our karakias I started. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pūnamu te moana, hei hurahi mo tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou ia, tātou katoa. Huye, tai kie. May peace be widespread. May the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together.
Thank you.